Before the sun, before the stars, and before the earth, there was only chaos. Our story begins not with the gods of Olympus, but with a formless, screaming void. But chaos was not a god in the way we understand them today. It was a yawning abyss, a dark and silent nothingness that stretched across the infinity of time. From this emptiness, the first powers of the universe began to coalesce. The first to emerge was Gaia, the deep-breasted earth, the eternal foundation of all things. She was followed by Tartarus, the dismal pit of the underworld, and Eros, the force of desire that would drive the creation of all life. Darkness and night soon followed. Erebus was born of chaos, representing the shadow of the world, and Nyx became the personification of the night. They were the first, the primordials, the raw materials of existence. But Gaia was lonely in the vastness of the young cosmos. Without a partner, she gave birth to Uranus, the starry sky, to cover her on every side. She also brought forth the Urea, the great mountains, and Pontus, the barren salt of the sea. Uranus was Gaia's equal in every way. He looked down upon his mother and his creator, and he took her as his wife. This was the first union, the first marriage of the universe. From this union, the first generation of children was born. They were the Titans, 12 beings of immense power and size. There was Oceanus, the river that encircled the world, and Tethys, his sister and wife. There was Hyperion, the lord of light, and Thea, the goddess of sight. Coeus represented the inquisitive mind, while Phoebe represented the radiance of the moon. Creus, Mnemosyne, Themis, and Iapetus followed. The youngest and most cunning of them all was Cronus. But these were not the only children of the sky and the earth. As Uranus continued to exert his dominance, Gaia gave birth to beings far more monstrous. The 3 Cyclopes were born, giants with a single massive eye in the center of their foreheads. Brontes, Steropes, and Arges were master craftsmen, possessing the power of thunder and lightning. Then came the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones. Cottus, Briareos, and Gyes each possessed 50 heads and 100 arms of terrifying strength. Uranus looked upon these monstrous children with a mixture of fear and absolute disgust. He was the first king of the universe, and he feared any threat to his absolute power. He decided that these children were too hideous to walk the surface of the earth. But instead of exile, he chose a far more cruel fate. Uranus forced the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires back into the womb of Gaia. He shoved them deep into the dark places of the earth, burying them within their own mother. This was the first act of tyranny in the history of existence. Uranus delighted in his wicked work, reigning supreme from the heights of the heavens. But Gaia was in agony. The weight of her hidden children caused her immense physical and emotional pain. She began to plot against her husband, the king who had turned into a jailer. Deep within her bowels, Gaia fashioned a new mineral, a gray flint of incredible hardness. She crafted a great jagged sickle, a weapon designed for a single bloody purpose. She called her Titan sons to her and revealed her plan for vengeance. She asked who among them was brave enough to strike down their father. The elder Titans trembled at the thought of challenging the sky. Uranus was vast, all-encompassing, and terrifying in his wrath. Only one stood forward. Cronus, the youngest, the most ambitious, and the most ruthless of the brothers, accepted the task. He hated his father's arrogance and craved the throne for himself. Gaia gave him the flint sickle and hid him in a secret place within her body. That night, Uranus descended from the heavens, bringing the darkness with him. He stretched himself over Gaia, seeking to take her in a lustful embrace once more. But Cronus was waiting in the shadows. As Uranus lowered himself, Cronus reached out with his left hand and seized his father. With his right hand, he swung the jagged sickle with all his might. He castrated his father in a single, agonizing stroke. The blood of Uranus sprayed across the earth. From these drops of divine blood, new beings were born. The Erinyes, the three furies of vengeance, rose from the crimson stains. The Gigantes, the great giants in shining armor, also sprang forth from the blood, and the Meliae, the nymphs of the ash trees, appeared in the wake of the violence. The severed genitals of Uranus were cast into the churning sea near the island of Cyprus. A white foam gathered around the divine flesh as it floated upon the waves. From this foam, a girl began to grow. She was Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, born from the violence of the first revolution. Uranus screamed in pain and retreated to the highest reaches of the sky, never again to descend and cover the earth. His reign was over. The power of the heavens had been broken by the hand of a son. But as he fled, Uranus looked down at Cronus with eyes full of hatred. He whispered a prophecy that would haunt the new king for all eternity. He told Cronus that he too would one day be overthrown by his own child. Cronus ignored the warning, blinded by his newfound glory. He released the Titans from their fear and established himself as the second ruler of the cosmos. The age of the primordials had ended. The age of the Titans had begun. But the cycle of blood and betrayal was only just beginning. Cronus was now the master of all existence. He stood atop the jagged peaks of Mount Othrys, the seat of the Titan power, looking out over a world that was still cooling from the fires of creation. He had achieved what no other being had dared. He had struck down the sky itself and claimed the mantle of king. But the crown felt heavy upon his brow from the very first moment of his ascension. The dying words of Uranus echoed in his mind like a rhythmic, haunting drum. He had betrayed his father to gain the throne, and he knew with a chilling certainty that his own children would eventually seek to do the same. To consolidate his power and ensure the legitimacy of his line, Cronus took his sister Rhea as his queen. Under his rule, the universe entered a period of deceptive calm known as the Golden Age. It was a time when the earth yielded its fruits without the need for toil, and the rivers ran with milk and nectar. The other Titans were granted vast domains to oversee. Oceanus ruled the great world stream that encircled the flat disk of the earth. Hyperion took command of the celestial lights, while Iapetus became the pillar of the west. But while the world flourished, the heart of the king was rotting with suspicion. Cronus became consumed by a cold, calculating paranoia that dictated every breath he took. He looked at his brothers and saw potential usurpers, and he looked at the horizon and saw only threats. When Rhea gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Hestia, Cronus did not feel the joy of a father. He felt only the cold, sharp grip of the prophecy. He took the infant from Rhea's trembling arms and, in a single horrific motion, he opened his massive maw and swallowed her whole. He intended to keep his rivals imprisoned within his own divine stomach, where no rebellion could ever take root. Rhea was devastated, but she was powerless against the king of the Titans. In the years that followed, the horror was repeated with a rhythmic, mechanical cruelty. Demeter was born and immediately consumed, followed by Hera, the future queen of heaven. Then came the sons, Hades, the lord of shadows, and Poseidon, the shaker of the earth. Each was swallowed by Cronus the moment they entered the world, trapped in the darkness of their father's gut. Cronus believed he had outsmarted fate itself through this systematic infanticide, but he had failed to account for the breaking point of a mother's grief. Rhea's sorrow had curdled into a burning desire for revolution. When she realized she was pregnant with her sixth child, she sought the counsel of her mother, Gaia. Gaia, who had once helped Cronus overthrow Uranus, was now ready to see her son brought low for his own crimes. Following Gaia's instructions, Rhea fled to the island of Crete under the cover of a moonless night. In the dark, echoing recesses of a cave on Mount Ida, she gave birth to a son named Zeus. She left the infant in the care of the Meliai nymphs and the divine goat Amalthea, whose milk would nourish the future king. To hide the baby's piercing cries from the ears of Cronus, Rhea recruited the Curetes. These were armored male deities who performed a wild, clashing dance, beating their shields together to drown out any sound of life. But Rhea still had to return to Mount Othrys and face her husband. She wrapped a large, heavy stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to the king as his newest son. Cronus, blinded by his own arrogance and the ease of his previous victories, did not even look at the bundle. He seized the stone and swallowed it greedily, believing he had finally secured his throne for all eternity. However, deep in the lush forests of Crete, the true heir was growing stronger every day. Zeus was raised on the milk of the goat and the golden honey of the wild bees. He was not like the Titans, he was something new, a being of focus, lightning, and intent. He grew into a god of immense physical strength and even greater cunning. As he reached maturity, he knew the time had come to fulfill the prophecy of his grandfather and liberate the world from the Titan's grip. But he was one man against an army of giants. He sought out Metis, the Titaness of wisdom, who possessed the knowledge of the old ways. She fashioned a powerful emetic potion, a mixture designed to purge the contents of a god's stomach. Disguised as a humble cupbearer, Zeus traveled to the heights of Mount Othrys and entered the court of his father. He served the mixture to Cronus during a grand, boastful feast of the Titans. Cronus drank deeply, and within moments, his divine body began to convulse in absolute agony. He fell from his throne, retching and gasping for air. First, he vomited up the great stone that had deceived him, a stone that would later be placed at Delphi to mark the center of the world. Then, one by one, the fully grown gods emerged from his throat, unharmed and fueled by centuries of repressed rage. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon stood before their father, their eyes burning with the fire of 1,000 suns. The household of Cronus was shattered. The long, peaceful golden age was over in an instant. The world was about to descend into the greatest and most violent conflict it had ever known. The young gods fled to the summit of Mount Olympus, establishing a base for their rebellion. The Titans gathered their forces at Mount Othrys, preparing to crush the upstarts who dared to challenge the natural order. The lines were drawn, and the air itself began to crackle with the energy of the coming storm. Zeus stood upon the highest peak of Mount Olympus, looking down at the massive army gathering at Mount Othrys. Zeus was no longer a hidden child of the caves, but a general leading a divine revolution. Beside him stood his siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, their eyes burning with the fire of centuries spent in the dark. But they were only 6, and the Titans were many. Cronus sat upon his throne of ancient stone, surrounded by his brothers and sisters who had ruled the cosmos since the dawn of time. Cronus looked every inch a ruler. There was Atlas, the son of Iapetus, who possessed a strength that could move mountains. There was Hyperion, the lord of light, and Coeus, the master of the inquisitive mind. The Titans were massive, ancient, and convinced of their own eternal right to rule. They looked up at the heights of Olympus and saw only a minor rebellion that would be crushed beneath their heels. But the young gods had the advantage of surprise and a burning desire for freedom. The first clash between the two sides shook the very foundations of the earth. The Titanomachy, the War of the Titans, had officially begun. It was not a war of weeks or months, but but a grinding, total conflict that would last for 10 long years. Each day, the heavens were lit with the fires of divine weaponry, and each night, the ground trembled with the weight of falling giants. The gods fought with swords of celestial bronze, and the titans fought with the raw forces of nature. However, despite their divine power, the war reached a brutal and bloody stalemate. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage over the other. The Olympians held the high ground of Olympus, while the Titans controlled the plains and the surrounding peaks. Zeus grew frustrated, realizing that raw strength alone would not be enough to unseat his father. He needed more than just warriors, he needed specialized tools of destruction. He sought the counsel of Gaia, the ancient mother of the earth, who had grown weary of the unending carnage. She told him that he would never win as long as his uncles remained imprisoned in the pit of Tartarus. Gaia revealed that the 3 Cyclopes and the 3 Hecatoncheires were still rotting in the darkness. They had been cast there by Uranus and forgotten by Cronus, who feared their monstrous forms. Zeus knew that to win the throne, he would have to descend into the deepest, darkest place in existence. He traveled to the edge of the world, where the yawning mouth of Tartarus awaited. The descent was long, filled with the screaming winds of the abyss and the stench of ancient rot. At the bottom of the pit, he found the 6 monsters, shackled in chains of indestructible metal and guarded by the dragon woman Campe. Campe was a nightmare of scales and venom, her waist surrounded by the heads of 50 beasts. But Zeus did not hesitate. He struck down the guardian and shattered the chains of the prisoners. The Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, and Arges rose from their knees, their single eyes blinking in the dim light. The Hecatoncheires, Cottus, Briareos, and Gaius flexed their 300 arms, ready for vengeance. In gratitude for their liberation, the Cyclopes, the master smiths of the universe, offered Zeus the ultimate weapons. For Zeus, they forged the thunderbolt, a shaft of pure, concentrated energy that could level cities. For Poseidon, they crafted the trident, a 3-pronged spear that could stir the oceans and shatter the earth. For Hades, they created the helm of darkness, which granted the wearer absolute invisibility. Armed with these instruments of power, Zeus led his new allies back to the surface. The arrival of the Hecatoncheires changed the entire geometry of the war. They were giants of impossible reach, capable of picking up entire hills and hurling them like pebbles. The final battle of the Titanomachy took place on the plains of Thessaly. The sky turned black with the smoke of 1,000 fires. Poseidon struck the ground with his trident, creating massive chasms that swallowed Titan battalions whole. Hades, invisible and silent, moved through the enemy lines like a ghost, sowing panic and terror. But the centerpiece of the assault was Zeus. He stood in the center of the storm, his thunderbolts raining down in a rhythmic, terrifying barrage. The earth scorched beneath his feet, and the oceans boiled with the intensity of his wrath. Cronus looked on in horror as his invincible brothers were driven back by the sheer volume of the assault. The Hecatoncheires stood at the front, their 600 hands throwing 300 boulders every single second. The Titans were being buried alive under a mountain of stone. One by one, the ancient lords were subdued. Cronus, the king who had swallowed his own children to prevent this day, was finally brought to his knees. Zeus stood over his father, the thunderbolt humming in his hand, a symbol of the new order. The war was over. The reign of the Titans, which had lasted for ages of man, was decimated in a final thunderous crescendo. But victory brought with it the burden of justice. Zeus did not execute the defeated. He chose a fate that would ensure they could never rise again. The Titans were shackled and cast down into the same pit of Tartarus where they had once left their brothers. They were imprisoned behind massive bronze doors, guarded forever by the Hecatoncheires they had once spurned. Atlas, however, was granted a unique and grueling punishment. Because he had led the Titan armies with such ferocity, Zeus decreed that he should stand at the western edge of the world. There, he would bear the weight of the entire celestial sphere upon his shoulders for all eternity. Atlas would carry that burden without end. The old world had been cleared away. The heavens were empty, and the earth was silent, waiting for a new master. Zeus and his siblings returned to the summit of Olympus to claim their prize, but the world was vast, and the division of power would be the first test of the new regime. The age of the Olympians was about to begin, but the shadows of the past still lingered in the corners of the world. The smoke of the Titanomachy finally cleared, leaving behind a world that was broken, scorched, and silent. Zeus stood upon the blackened ruins of the old world, the thunderbolt still humming with the residue of 1,000 strikes. He was the victor, the liberator, and the new master of all existence. But victory did not immediately bring peace. It brought the heavy burden of legitimacy. Zeus knew that he could not rule alone, for the memory of his father's paranoia was still fresh in the minds of his siblings. The universe was vast, and its diverse domains required a distribution of power to prevent a second civil war. To decide the fate of the cosmos, the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, gathered at the center of the world. They did not fight, and they did not argue. Instead, they chose to leave the division of the universe to the hands of fate. They placed 3 lots into a helmet, each representing a major realm of existence. Poseidon reached in first and drew the lot of the wine-dark sea. He became the Earth-shaker, the master of the oceans and the hidden depths where the currents move like liquid glass. Hades drew the second lot, claiming the realm of the unseen. He was granted the underworld, the dark and echoing kingdom of the dead, where the sun never shines. Zeus drew the final lot, the lot of the wide and starry heavens. He became the king of the gods, the cloud gatherer, and the supreme arbiter of the celestial order. However, the earth itself and the heights of Mount Olympus remained common ground, shared by all, but governed by Zeus. The ascension of Zeus marked the formal beginning of the Olympian age. But a king is nothing without a court, and Zeus immediately set about consolidating his power through a series of divine unions. He first took Metis, the Titaness of wisdom, as his consort to ensure that his reign would be guided by intellect rather than just raw force. But a prophecy soon reached his ears, claiming that Metis would bear a son who would be greater than his father. Zeus, fearing the same fate that had befallen Uranus and Cronus, chose a different path than his ancestors. He did not swallow the child, he swallowed the mother. By consuming Metis, Zeus incorporated wisdom into his very being, ensuring he could never be outmaneuvered. Later, he claimed his sister Hera as his queen, establishing a royal household that would symbolize the permanence of his rule. Under his direction, the palace of Olympus was constructed by the Cyclopes and the god Hephaestus. It was a city of gold and marble, perched above the clouds, where the air was pure and the light was eternal. But Gaia, the ancient mother of the earth, was not pleased with the new order. She mourned the imprisonment of her Titan sons in the lightless pit of Tartarus. She saw Zeus not as a rightful king, but as a young usurper who had forgotten the debt he owed to the earth. In her rage, Gaia brought forth a new race of terrors, the Gigantes. They were massive, armored beings with serpent-like legs and a strength that rivaled the Titans. The Gigantomachy, the war of the giants, erupted with a violence that threatened to undo all of Zeus's progress. The giants hurled entire mountains at the gates of Olympus, their screams echoing across the continents. However, a prophecy stated that the gods could only defeat the giants with the help of a mortal hero. Zeus looked down at the young world of men and saw the potential for a champion, a theme that would define the coming ages. With the eventual aid of the demigod Heracles, the Olympians methodically decimated the giant ranks. Each giant was struck down by a combination of divine lightning and mortal steel. But Gaia had one final, terrifying card to play. Deep within the steaming vents of the earth, she coupled with Tartarus to create a monster of absolute destruction. He was Typhoeus, the Typhon, a creature of such size that his head brushed the stars. 100 dragon heads sprouted from his shoulders, each breathing fire and screaming in a cacophony of animalistic rage. When Typhon marched toward Olympus, the other gods fled in terror, disguising themselves as animals to escape his reach. Only Zeus stood his ground. The duel between the king of the gods and the father of monsters shook the universe to its core. Typhon tore up the earth and hurled it at the sky, and Zeus responded with a rhythmic, unrelenting barrage of thunderbolts. But Typhon was resilient, his scales as hard as mountain stone, and his blood a boiling venom. At one point, the monster managed to seize Zeus, cutting the sinews from his limbs and leaving the king helpless in a cave. It was a moment of absolute turmoil, where the Olympian order sat on the precipice of total collapse. However, the cunning of Hermes and the loyalty of Pan allowed Zeus to recover his strength. Rearmed and fueled by a divine fury, Zeus pursued Typhon across the world. In a final, thunderous crescendo, Zeus lifted the massive Mount Etna and slammed it down upon the monster. Typhon was buried alive, his trapped breath still causing the volcano to smoke and rumble to this day. The threat was over. The legitimacy of Zeus was no longer a question, it was a physical reality. The Titanomachy, the Gigantomachy, and the trial of Typhon had all been surmounted. The golden age of Cronus was a memory, and the iron age of the Olympians was firmly established. But with the world secured, Zeus turned his attention to the creation of something new. He looked down at the empty plains and the silent forests, and he realized that the gods needed a reflection. The age of the divine was established, and the age of the mortal was about to begin. With the Titans imprisoned and Typhon buried beneath the weight of the earth, Zeus turned his gaze toward the silent plains of the world. The gods sat upon their golden thrones, a choir without an audience, masters of a realm that lacked the pulse of mortal life. Zeus desired a new race of beings, ones who would inhabit the earth and offer sacrifices to the heavens to maintain the divine order. He did not perform this task himself. Instead, he delegated the labor to the sons of the Titan Iapetus. Prometheus, whose name means foresight, and his brother Epimetheus, whose name means hindsight, were commissioned to populate the world. Epimetheus, impulsive and lacking in vision, took charge of the animals first. He distributed the gifts of the gods with a reckless hand, granting speed to the cheetah and flight to the eagle. He gave thick fur to the bear for the winter and sharp claws to the lion for the hunt. But when he finally turned to the creation of man, he realized he had exhausted all the divine attributes. Man stood naked in the mud, possessing neither the strength of the bull nor the swiftness of the hawk. Prometheus looked upon this unfinished creature with a deep, unexpected empathy. He saw in man a spark that the other animals lacked, a capacity for reason and a potential for greatness. Prometheus took a lump of clay and fashioned it into the likeness of the gods, molding a being that walked upright to face the stars. But man was weak and fragile, shivering in the shadows of the caves as the nights grew cold and long. Prometheus knew that for man to survive, they needed the one gift that Zeus had strictly forbidden to mortals. They needed fire. Fire was the exclusive property of the gods, the sacred energy that powered the forge of Hephaestus and the hearth of Hestia. Zeus had withheld it because he feared that man, if granted the power of the sun, would one day challenge the legitimacy of the Olympians. But Prometheus was a rebel at heart, a titan who had sided with the gods only to see them become the new tyrants. He traveled to the heights of Olympus, carrying a hollow stalk of fennel as his only tool. With a silent, practiced motion, he stole a single spark from the chariot of the sun and hid it within the stalk. He descended to the earth and gifted the flame to the shivering tribes of man. Suddenly, the darkness of the world was pierced by 1,000 flickering lights. With fire, man began to cook meat, to forge tools of bronze, and to build the first cities of the mortal age. However, the smoke from these new fires rose to the nostrils of Zeus, who watched the transformation from his throne. He looked down and saw the glow of human progress, and his heart filled with a divine, terrifying rage. Prometheus had not only stolen a physical flame, he had stolen the autonomy of the gods. Zeus decided that the punishment for this theft must be as eternal as the crime was bold. He ordered Hephaestus and the wind gods to seize Prometheus and drag him to the highest peaks of the Caucasus Mountains. There the Titan was shackled to a jagged rock with chains of indestructible iron that no god or mortal could break. Zeus sent a massive eagle, a creature of his own divine essence, to torment the prisoner. Every day the eagle would swoop down and tear open the Titan's side, devouring his liver with a rhythmic, bloody efficiency. Because Prometheus was immortal, his liver would regrow every night, only to be eaten again the following morning. It was a cycle of agony, designed to last until the end of time itself. But Zeus was not finished with his vengeance. He knew that punishing the creator was not enough to subdue the creation. He turned his attention to the mortal race that had accepted the stolen fire. Zeus commanded Hephaestus to fashion a new kind of being, the first woman. Her name was Pandora, meaning all-gifted, and each of the gods bestowed upon her a unique attribute. Athena gave her the skill of weaving. Aphrodite gave her a grace that could drive men to madness. Hermes gave her the gift of silver-tongued persuasion. Zeus added a final, hidden quality to her soul, a burning, unquenchable curiosity. He sent Pandora to the earth as a gift to Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus who lived among the mortals. Pandora was beautiful, and Epimetheus was true to his name. From his rocky prison, Prometheus had warned his brother never to accept a gift from the king of the gods. But Epimetheus saw the danger only after it was too late. He was captivated by Pandora's beauty and took her as his wife, welcoming her into the world of men. Along with Pandora, Zeus had sent a large sealed jar, sometimes called a box in later stories. He told Pandora that the jar must never be opened, for it contained the secrets of the gods. For a time, Pandora lived in peace, but the divine curiosity planted by Zeus began to fester in her mind. She looked at the jar every day, wondering what treasures or mysteries lay beneath its heavy lid. The temptation grew until it became a physical weight, a pressure that could no longer be ignored. One afternoon, when the world was quiet, Pandora approached the jar and slowly lifted the seal. In an instant, the air turned cold and thick with a swarm of invisible screeching horrors. From the jar flew all the evils that had never before touched the world of man: sickness, old age, labor, and envy. They spread across the earth like a plague, infecting the once pristine lives of the mortal tribes. Pandora, horrified by what she had unleashed, scrambled to replace the lid as the last of the spirits escaped. But she was too late. The world was already decimated by the sorrows of the divine. As she looked into the bottom of the jar, one small thing remained trapped beneath the rim. It was hope. Zeus had placed it there as the final irony, a small light to keep men struggling through the darkness he had created. The age of innocence was over, and the era of suffering had officially begun. Man now had fire, but they also had the knowledge of their own inevitable death. Prometheus remained in chains, and the world below him began to turn from gold to iron. As the human population grew, so did the complexity of their sins, and Zeus began to regret the very existence of the race he had commissioned. The 5 ages of man were not a progression of glory, but a long, slow descent into the dirt. The Golden Age had been a dream of peace under the rule of Cronus, where men lived like gods and death was only a quiet sleep. When Zeus took the throne, the metal of humanity began to tarnish. The Silver Age followed, a time of stunted growth where men remained as children for 100 years, hiding in their mothers' shadows. They were a weak and insolent generation, refusing to offer the proper sacrifices to the new masters of Olympus. Zeus, in his growing impatience, swept them away, burying them in the earth to make room for a more vigorous race. The Bronze Age emerged from the ash trees, a race of men who loved only the clatter of spears and the red mist of the battlefield. They did not eat bread, they lived on the adrenaline of the hunt and the slaughter. Their houses were made of bronze, their armor was bronze, and they worked only with the heavy, blunt metal of their namesake. They were decimated by their own violence, descending into the dark house of Hades without leaving a name or a legacy behind. Then came the Iron Age, our own era, where toil is constant and the heart of man is filled with a bitter, grinding envy. Zeus watched the growth of the iron race with a mixture of contempt and growing alarm. The world was becoming a hive of corruption, where the guest was no longer safe at the table and the son plotted against the father. But the final straw for the king of the gods did not come from the masses, but from a single, arrogant king named Lycaon. Lycaon ruled Arcadia with a hand of iron and a heart of absolute malice. Word of his cruelty reached the heights of Olympus, and Zeus decided to descend in the guise of a humble traveler to test the mortal world. He walked the streets of Arcadia, watching as the people cowered in fear of their king. Lycaon, suspicious and cruel, suspected that his guest might be more than he appeared. He decided to test the divinity of the stranger by serving him a feast of human flesh. He slaughtered a captive, a young boy from a neighboring tribe, and served the roasted remains to the king of the gods. The transformation was instantaneous. Zeus rose from the table in a blinding flash of divine light, his presence filling the hall like a physical weight. His rage leveled the palace of Lycaon in a single thunderous stroke of fire. He cursed the king, transforming him into a wolf, a beast that would forever reflect the predatory and bloodthirsty nature of his soul. But the sin of Lycaon was seen by Zeus as the sin of all mankind. The king of the gods looked at the world and saw only a rot that needed to be excised with the precision of a surgeon. He did not reach for his thunderbolts, for he feared that the heat of the fire would consume the very fabric of the cosmos and the heavens themselves. Instead, he called upon his brother Poseidon and the winds of the south to unleash a different kind of destruction. The great deluge began with a rhythmic, unrelenting rain that lasted for 9 days and 9 nights. The wine-dark sea rose above the cliffs, and the rivers burst their banks, swallowing the cities, the forests, and the mountains. The mortal race was decimated, their cries for mercy lost in the churning, grey waters of the world's storm. Everything that breathed was extinguished in the cold embrace of the tide. However, 2 souls had been warned of the coming storm by the foresight of the shackled Prometheus. Deucalion, the son of the Titan, and his wife Pyrrha had constructed a small, sturdy chest of wood, stocking it with the bare essentials of survival. They floated upon the surface of the drowned world for days, the only living witnesses to the end of an era. When the waters finally receded and the clouds parted to reveal a sun that felt like a stranger, the chest came to rest on the peaks of Mount Parnassus. They were alone in a world of mud and silence, the last of the Iron Race standing in the wreckage of a civilization. They traveled to the ruined temple of Thebes, seeking a way to repair the world and appease the gods. The oracle spoke in a voice of rust and stone, telling them to cast the bones of their mother behind them as they walked. Pyrrha was horrified, believing the oracle commanded them to desecrate the graves of their ancestors. But Deucalion, possessing the sharp mind of his father, understood the riddle. The mother was Gaia, the earth, and her bones were the stones that lay scattered across the barren landscape. They began to walk across the mud, throwing stones over their shoulders without looking back. The stones thrown by Deucalion became men, and the stones thrown by Pyrrha became women. A new race was born, hard and resilient, forged from the very rock of the world. This was the race of stone, a humanity destined to endure the hardships of the Iron Age with a new kind of stubbornness. Zeus looked down and allowed this new generation to flourish, but he would no longer remain a distant observer. The gods began to descend, walking among men and interbreeding with the royal houses of the earth. The age of the Great Flood was over, but the era of the heroic age was just beginning to stir in the dust of Argos. The stones of Deucalion had barely hardened into flesh before the new race of man began to organize into tribes, and the tribes into kingdoms. The fertile plains of Argos became the beating heart of this new world. Our story shifts to the lineage of Inachus, the river god who founded the city of Argos and established the first great dynasty of men. But power in the mortal realm was as volatile as the lightning of Zeus. The throne passed through generations of blood and iron, eventually coming to the twin brothers Acrisius and Prometheus. They were the sons of Abas, and they had hated each other since they were in their mother's womb. Their rivalry was a rhythmic, grinding conflict that tore the kingdom of Argos apart. After years of civil war, a sovereign handoff was forced by the exhaustion of the people. Acrisius claimed the throne of Argos, while Prometheus was exiled, eventually seizing the city of Tiryns for himself. But Acrisius was a man consumed by a cold, clinical paranoia. He had no sons to inherit his crown, only a single daughter named Danae. He traveled to the oracle at Delphi, seeking to know if he would ever father a male heir to consolidate his rule. The oracle's response was a death sentence for the king's peace of mind. She prophesied that Acrisius would never have a son, but that he would be killed by the hand of his grandson. Acrisius returned to Argos, his heart filled with a desperate, calculating cruelty. He did not kill his daughter, for he feared the wrath of the Furies who punished the shedding of kindred blood. Instead, he constructed a subterranean chamber of solid bronze, burying Danae alive beneath the earth. He believed that by denying her the company of men, he could effectively outmaneuver fate itself. But Acrisius had forgotten that the walls of man are like paper to the gods of Olympus. Zeus looked down from the heights and saw the golden beauty of the imprisoned princess. Zeus saw her. He transformed himself into a shower of liquid gold, seeping through the cracks in the bronze roof and falling into Danae's lap. This was a divine union of light and shadow, and from it a boy was born. His name was Perseus. For 4 years, Danae kept the child hidden in the darkness of the bronze chamber, her heart pounding at every footstep of the palace guards. But the cries of a growing boy could not be muffled forever. Acrisius heard the sound of laughter coming from the ground and realized his prison had been breached. He was terrified and furious, his legitimacy threatened by a child who did not even know his name. He refused to believe the child was the son of Zeus, accusing his brother Prometheus of a secret seduction. He ordered a massive wooden chest to be built, a coffin for the living. He forced Danae and the infant Perseus into the box and cast them into the churning, wine-dark sea. He watched from the cliffs as the waves carried his fear away, hoping the salt and the storm would finish what he could not. But the chest did not sink. It was guided by the unseen hand of Poseidon. It drifted across the Aegean until it was caught in the nets of a humble fisherman named Dictys on the island of Seriphos. Dictys was a man of honor, and he raised Perseus as his own, while Danae lived in the shadow of the island's palace. Seriphos was ruled by Polydectes, the brother of Dictys, a king whose lust was only matched by his arrogance. As Perseus grew into a young man of immense strength and focus, Polydectes began to eye Danae with a predatory intent. He saw Perseus as the only obstacle to his desires and sought a way to remove the youth from the island forever. Polydectes staged a grand banquet and demanded that every guest provide a horse as a gift to help him win a bride. Perseus, poor and possessing only his pride, rashly claimed he could bring the king anything, even the head of the Gorgon Medusa. Polydectes seized the opportunity, holding Perseus to his word and sending him on a suicide mission. Medusa was a creature of absolute horror, a once beautiful woman cursed by Athena. Her hair was a writhing mass of venomous serpents, and her gaze was so terrifying that it turned any living thing to stone. Perseus set out into the unknown, a mortal boy tasked to decimate a monster that even gods avoided. But the Olympians had not forgotten the son of Zeus. Hermes, the messenger god, gifted him a curved adamantine sickle and winged sandals for the flight. Athena provided him with a shield of polished bronze, a mirror to see the world without looking at it directly. Perseus traveled to the ends of the earth, seeking the Grey Ae, 3 ancient hags who shared a single eye and a single tooth. He stole their eye, forcing them to reveal the location of the nymphs who held the tools he truly needed. He obtained the Helm of Darkness from the underworld and a magic knapsack to hold the trophy of his hunt. He flew to the edge of the world, where the Gorgons lived in a landscape of frozen stone statues, the remains of heroes who had failed. Using the reflection in his shield, Perseus moved with a rhythmic, calculated precision. While the Gorgons slept, he swung the sickle in a single, clean arc. The head of Medusa was severed, and from her neck sprang the winged horse Pegasus and the giant Chrysaor. Perseus thrust the head into his bag and fled into the sky, the invisible helm shielding him from the pursuit of Medusa's immortal sisters. His journey home was a path of blood and destiny. In the kingdom of Ethiopia, he found the princess Andromeda chained to a rock, a sacrifice to a sea monster sent by Poseidon. Her mother, Cassiopeia, had boasted that her beauty surpassed the sea nymphs, and the kingdom was being decimated by the gods' wrath. Perseus descended from the sky like a thunderbolt, slaying the beast and claiming Andromeda as his wife. He returned to Seriphos just as Polydectes was attempting to force himself upon Danae. Perseus entered the palace hall and called for his friends to shield their eyes. He pulled the head of Medusa from the bag, and in a heartbeat, the court of Polydectes became a gallery of silent grey stone. But the prophecy of the oracle was still waiting in the shadows of Argos. Perseus returned to the mainland, seeking to reconcile with his grandfather, Acrisius. Acrisius, hearing of his grandson's return, fled in terror to the city of Larissa, hoping to hide among the crowds. Perseus followed, not to kill, but to compete in the funeral games being held for a local king. When it was Perseus's turn to throw the discus, a sudden, violent gust of wind caught the heavy bronze disc. It veered into the crowd and struck an old man on the foot, killing him instantly. The old man was Acrisius. The prophecy was fulfilled with the cold, mechanical inevitability of fate. Perseus was the rightful king of Argos, but he could not bear to rule the city of the man he had accidentally slain. He traded kingdoms with his cousin Megapenthes, taking the throne of Tiryns and founding the great citadel of Mycenae. The walls of Mycenae were built by the Cyclopes, stones so massive that no human hand could move them. The Perseid dynasty was established, a line of kings that would eventually lead to the greatest hero of them all. But the blood of Argos was only one stream in the growing river of myth. To the north, a new tragedy was brewing in the house of Thebes. The walls of Mycenae were still fresh with the chisel marks of the Cyclopes when the lineage of Perseus began to splinter. The great hero had left behind a kingdom of stone and a bloodline that was destined to dominate the Peloponnese. But the peace of the founder did not survive his sons. Perseus passed the throne to his eldest, Electryon, who immediately faced a reign of turmoil and cattle raids from neighboring tribes. During a chaotic skirmish, Electryon was accidentally killed by his own nephew, Amphitryon. It was a moment of absolute disaster for the royal house. Sthenelus, the younger brother of Electryon, seized the opportunity to act as a usurper. He charged Amphitryon with the murder of the king and drove him into exile, consolidating his own power over Mycenae and Tiryns. Amphitryon fled to the city of Thebes, taking with him his beautiful cousin, Alcmene, the daughter of the fallen king. Alcmene was a woman of immense dignity and focus, and she refused to marry Amphitryon until he had avenged the deaths of her brothers in battle. But while Amphitryon was away leading a campaign against the Teleboans, the king of the gods was watching. Zeus looked down from Olympus and saw in Alcmene the perfect vessel for a hero who would finally protect both gods and men. He did not appear to her as a shower of gold or a beast of the forest. He chose a more intimate deception. Zeus took the form of Amphitryon, returning from the war with the stories of victory still fresh on his lips. He commanded the sun not to rise for 3 days, stretching a single night into a long divine embrace. The real Amphitryon returned the next morning, confused to find his wife already satisfied and exhausted by his return. Hera was furious, and Alcmene was soon pregnant with twins, one fathered by a god and the other by a mortal. Hera looked at the growing belly of Alcmene and saw a living monument to her husband's infidelity. She was the goddess of marriage, and she felt the legitimacy of her own throne threatened by every divine bastard Zeus produced. Hera began to plot a rhythmic, calculated revenge that would begin before the children were even born. Zeus, boastful and arrogant in his excitement, made a grand proclamation before the assembled gods of Olympus. He declared that the next son born of the house of Perseus that very day would become the high king of all Greece. He intended this for his son, the child within Alcmene. But Hera was more cunning than the cloud gatherer. She used her divine power to delay the labor of Alcmene, holding the divine infant back with the help of the goddess of childbirth. At the same time, she accelerated the birth of another child in the lineage, Eurystheus, the son of the usurper Sthenelus. Eurystheus was born premature, a weak and spindly child, but he was technically the first to arrive. Zeus was trapped by his own unbreakable oath. The divine child would not be a king, he would be a subject. When the labor of Alcmene finally broke, 2 boys entered the world. The first was Iphicles, the son of Amphitryon. The second was Alcides, the child of Zeus, who would later be known to history as Heracles. Hera's hatred did not end with the stolen throne. When the infants were only 8 months old, she sent 2 massive venomous serpents into the nursery. The snakes slithered over the side of the wooden cradle, their scales rasping against the grain of the wood. Iphicles screamed in terror, his mortal instincts sensing the presence of death. But the infant Heracles did not cry. He looked at the monsters with a cold, curious focus. With a strength that defied the laws of nature, he reached out and seized a serpent in each of his tiny hands. He squeezed with a rhythmic, steady pressure until the life was gone from their bodies. Amphitryon rushed into the room to find his stepson laughing, holding the limp remains of the divine assassins. It was the first sign that this child was not meant for a normal life. Heracles grew with a speed that frightened the people of Thebes. He was a giant of a youth, his appetite and his temper both possessing a volcanic intensity. He was trained by the greatest masters of the age. Castor taught him to fight, and Eurytus taught him the bow. But Heracles was a creature of raw instinct, often unable to control the surging power in his veins. During a music lesson, his teacher Linus corrected him once too often. Heracles, in a fit of sudden rage, struck Linus with his lyre, killing the man instantly. Amphitryon, fearing the boy's strength, sent him away to the hills to live among the cattle herds. It was there, in the solitude of the mountains, that Heracles truly began to consolidate his physical power. He killed the Cithaeroneian lion that had been decimating the local flocks, wearing its skin as an indestructible cloak. He returned to Thebes as a savior, leading a small army to defeat the Minyans and liberate the city from a heavy tribute. In gratitude, King Creon of Thebes gave Heracles his daughter Megara in marriage. For a few years, it seemed as though the divine bastard had found a path to peace. He had a home, a wife, and 3 beautiful children. But Hera was only biding her time. She looked down at the happiness of Heracles and felt a cold, sharp envy. She descended to the earth and struck the hero with a sudden, blinding madness. In a state of absolute turmoil, Heracles saw his own family as monsters and enemies of the state. He seized his bow and his club and slaughtered Megara and his children in a rhythmic, bloody frenzy. When the madness finally lifted, he found himself sitting in the wreckage of his life, his hands stained with the blood of those he loved. The hero was broken, a shell of a man staring at a void that could never be filled. He sought the oracle at Delphi, looking for a way to purge the stain of his crime. The oracle told him that his only hope for legitimacy and peace was to travel to Mycenae. He was ordered to serve his cousin, King Eurystheus, the man who sat on the throne that should have been his. He was to perform whatever tasks the king demanded of him. Heracles knew that Eurystheus was a coward who hated him, but he had no choice. The 12 years of service were about to begin. The strongest man in the world was now a slave to the weakest. Heracles stood before the massive lion gate of Mycenae, a broken man seeking the only path to a clean soul. He was the strongest son of Zeus, but he was now a servant to the weakest of kings. Eurystheus sat upon the throne of Mycenae, trembling at the mere sight of his cousin. He was a man of small stature and even smaller courage, and he looked at the giant before him with a cold, calculated dread. He did not want to see Heracles redeemed. He wanted to see him decimated. Eurystheus devised a series of 10 tasks, later expanded to 12, that were designed to be impossible for any mortal to survive. The first labor was to slay the Nemean lion, a beast whose fur was impenetrable to any weapon of man or god. Heracles tracked the monster to its cave and realized that his arrows and his club were useless against its divine hide. But the hero did not retreat. He entered the dark, narrow confines of the cave and seized the lion with his bare hands. He used his rhythmic, crushing strength to choke the life out of the beast. When it was dead, he used the lion's own razor-sharp claws to skin it, creating the indestructible cloak he would wear for the rest of his life. He returned to Mycenae, and the sight of the lion's head so terrified Eurystheus that the king hid in a large bronze jar buried in the floor. From his hiding place, Eurystheus issued the second command: destroy the Lernaean Hydra. The Hydra was a 9-headed serpent of absolute venom that lived in the swamps of Lerna. For every head Heracles cut off, two more would grow in its place, making it a rhythmic, self-renewing nightmare. Heracles called upon his nephew Iolaus for assistance. As Heracles severed a head, Iolaus would immediately cauterize the neck with a burning torch, preventing the regeneration. But Hera, watching from above, sent a giant crab to distract the hero. Heracles crushed the crab beneath his heel and finished the Hydra, dipping his arrows in its venomous blood to create the deadliest ammunition in the world. However, Eurystheus refused to count this labor because Iolaus had helped, claiming it was a violation of the terms. The third labor was the capture of the Ceryneian hind, a deer with golden antlers and hooves of bronze that was sacred to Artemis. It was so fast that it could outrun an arrow, and Heracles spent a full year pursuing it through the forests. He eventually trapped it by a river, wounding it slightly to slow it down without shedding its sacred blood. The fourth task sent him into the mountains to capture the Erymanthian boar. Heracles drove the massive beast into deep snow, where its weight became its downfall, allowing him to bind it in chains. The fifth labor was a deliberate attempt by Eurystheus to humiliate the son of Zeus. He was ordered to clean the stables of King Augeas in a single day. The stables housed thousands of cattle and had not been cleaned for 30 years, a task of absolute filth and physical impossibility. But Heracles did not pick up a shovel. He used his divine strength to divert two rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, flushing the stables clean in a matter of hours. But again, Eurystheus invalidated the labor, claiming that Heracles had asked for payment from Augeas. The sixth labor took him to the marshes of Stymphalos to kill a flock of man-eating birds with feathers of bronze. Athena provided him with bronze crotala, or rattles, forged by Hephaestus. The rhythmic clashing of the rattles drove the birds into the air, where Heracles picked them off with his poisoned arrows. For his seventh labor, Heracles left the mainland to capture the Cretan bull that was ravaging the island of King Minos. He wrestled the bull to the ground and rode it across the sea back to the Peloponnese, a feat of absolute dominance. The eighth labor was the capture of the man-eating mares of Diomedes in Thrace. Heracles fed the cruel king to his own horses, taming them with the taste of their master's flesh. The ninth task was a journey to the edge of the known world to retrieve the girdle of Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons. Hippolyta was impressed by the hero's fame and agreed to give him the girdle freely. But Hera, disguised as an Amazon warrior, spread a rumor that Heracles had come to kidnap their queen. A sudden, violent skirmish erupted, and Heracles, suspecting a trap, killed Hippolyta and took the girdle by force. The 10th labor was the theft of the cattle of Geryon, a three-headed giant who lived on the island of Erythea. Heracles traveled across North Africa, and in a fit of heat-induced rage, he fired an arrow at the sun itself. Helios, the sun god, was so impressed by the hero's audacity that he lent Heracles his golden cup to sail across the ocean. Heracles killed the giant and the two-headed dog Orthrus, bringing the red cattle back through Italy and Greece. But Eurystheus demanded 2 more labors to replace the ones he had disqualified. The 11th labor was to retrieve the golden apples of the Hesperides, guarded by a 100-headed dragon at the end of the world. Heracles knew that no mortal could find the secret garden, so he sought out Atlas, the titan who held up the sky. Heracles offered to take the weight of the heavens upon his own shoulders if Atlas would fetch the apples for him. For a brief, terrifying moment, the son of Zeus bore the entire celestial sphere, his muscles straining against the infinite mass of the stars. Atlas returned with the apples but did not want to resume his burden. But Heracles used his cunning, asking Atlas to hold the sky for just a moment while he adjusted a pad for his shoulders. As soon as Atlas took the weight, Heracles seized the apples and fled. The final and most terrifying labor was the descent into the underworld itself. He was ordered to bring back Cerberus, the three-headed hound that guarded the gates of the dead. Hades, the lord of the shadows, agreed to let Heracles take the dog, provided he could subdue it using no weapons at all. Heracles wrapped his massive arms around the beast, ignoring the snapping jaws and the venomous snake tail. He choked the monster into submission and dragged it into the light of day. When he arrived at Mycenae with the Hound of Hell, Eurystheus was so decimated by fear that he permanently dove into his bronze jar, begging Heracles to take the monster back. The 12 labors were complete. The hero's crime was purged, and his fame was now solidified across the entire earth. But Heracles was a man of action who could not settle into a life of peace. He was a force of nature, and his final days would be defined by a new betrayal and a fire that would consume the mortal to birth the god. Heracles was finally a free man, his debt to Eurystheus paid in full, and his soul ostensibly cleansed. But the peace he sought remained elusive, for the blood of his family still haunted his dreams. He wandered the world, a living legend whose shadow fell long over every city he entered. He eventually came to the court of Oeneus, king of Calydon, where he sought the hand of the princess Deianira. He had to wrestle the river god Achelous to win her, breaking one of the god's horns in a display of absolute dominance. They left Calydon to find a new home, eventually reaching the river Evenus. The centaur Nessus offered to carry Deianira across the churning water. But halfway across, the centaur's animal nature took hold and he attempted to abduct the princess. Heracles did not hesitate, drawing a bowstring and firing an arrow dipped in the lethal venom of the Hydra. The arrow pierced the centaur's heart, but as he lay dying, he whispered a final, poisonous lie into Deianira's ear. He told her to collect his blood, claiming it was a powerful love potion that would ensure Heracles remained faithful forever. Years passed, and Heracles' fame continued to grow as he sacked cities and claimed new prizes of war. When Deianira heard that her husband was bringing home a beautiful captive named Iole, her heart was decimated by jealousy. She remembered the gift of Nessus and smeared the centaur's blood onto a magnificent tunic for her husband. Heracles put on the shirt, and the heat of his body activated the Hydra's venom. The cloth fused to his skin, burning him with a rhythmic, searing pain that no mortal could endure. He tried to tear the garment off, but it took pieces of his own flesh with it. In his agony, he threw the servant who had delivered the shirt into the sea, but the fire in his veins would not be extinguished. Unable to die, but unable to live in such torment, Heracles climbed the summit of Mount Oeta. He built a massive pyre of oak and pine, laying himself upon it like a sacrificial victim. He asked his friend Philoctetes to light the fire, for no other man had the courage to strike the spark. As the flames rose, the mortal half of Heracles, the blood inherited from Alcmene, was burned away. The sky itself began to crackle and moan. Zeus looked down and declared that the divine spirit of his son was too great for the house of Hades. A cloud descended from the heavens, and amidst the roll of thunder, Heracles was carried to the heights of Olympus. The strongest man in the world had achieved the ultimate sovereign handoff, passing from the realm of the dying to the realm of the eternal. Even Hera, his lifelong persecutor, finally relented, giving him her daughter Hebe in marriage as a sign of absolute reconciliation. The lone, wandering hero of the early age was gone, but his legend became the foundation of all who followed. The world was growing crowded with heroes, and the gods were beginning to tire of their individual exploits. The time was coming for a grand gathering, a collective quest that would test the mettle of an entire generation. In the kingdom of Iolcus, a young man with one sandal was preparing to challenge a usurper and claim a throne. The apotheosis of Heracles signaled the end of the age of the solitary wanderer. The gods now looked for a collective display of mortal excellence, a gathering of the greatest bloodlines to ever walk the earth. In the coastal kingdom of Iolcus, the sovereign handoff had been a bloody and illegitimate affair. King Aeson had been the rightful ruler, but he was ruthlessly overthrown by his power-hungry half-brother, Peleus. Peleus was a man of cold calculation and deep superstition, ruling with a hand of iron while constantly looking over his shoulder. Aeson's infant son, Jason, was smuggled out of the city in the dead of night to save him from the usurper's blade. The boy was raised in the wilderness by the wise centaur Chiron, the same tutor who had trained the greatest heroes of the age. Jason grew into a man of focus and quiet charisma, but he possessed a destiny that would decimate the peace of the usurper. An oracle warned Peleus to beware the man with one sandal, a prophecy that the king kept close to his chest for decades. Years later, a young man appeared at the court of Iolcus, his foot bare because he had lost a sandal helping an old woman cross a swollen river. The old woman was actually Hera in disguise, testing the youth and finding him worthy of her divine patronage. Peleus looked at the one-sandaled stranger and felt a rhythmic, cold dread thumping in his heart. When Jason demanded the return of his father's throne, Peleus did not refuse him openly. Instead, he proposed a task so perilous that no man had ever returned from the eastern edge of the world. He ordered Jason to retrieve the golden fleece from the distant kingdom of Colchis. The fleece was the hide of a divine ram that had once carried 2 children across the sea to safety. It was now a symbol of kingship and absolute legitimacy. It was guarded by a sleepless dragon and held in the sacred grove of Ares, the god of war. Jason accepted the challenge, and he sent out a call to every hero in Greece to join his cause. This was the first great assembly of the heroic age. The crew of the Argo, the first great ship of history, included the strongest and most famous names of the era. There was Orpheus, whose music could move stones, Castor and Pollux, the divine twins, and even Heracles himself before his final labors were complete. The voyage of the Argo was a linear grind through a world of monsters and shifting geography. They encountered the Harpies, the hounds of Zeus, who were decimating the food of the blind seer Phineus. The sons of the North Wind drove the monsters away, and in return, Phineus told the heroes how to navigate the simple gades. These were the clashing rocks, massive cliffs that smashed together whenever a ship tried to pass between them. Jason used a dove to test the rhythm of the stones, slipping the Argo through with only a minor scrape to its stern. They finally reached Colchis, where the Sun King Aetes ruled with a divine and terrifying authority. Aetes had no intention of surrendering the fleece, and he set Jason a series of impossible trials. He was ordered to yoke 2 fire-breathing bulls with bronze hooves and sow a field with the teeth of a dragon. But Jason was not alone. He had the help of the king's daughter, the sorceress Medea. Medea was a woman of absolute power and even more absolute obsession. She fell in love with Jason and provided him with a magic ointment that made his flesh invulnerable to the fire of the bulls. When the dragon's teeth were sown and a race of armed warriors sprang from the earth, Jason used Medea's advice to turn them against one another. He threw a stone into their midst, and the warriors, confused and paranoid, decimated their own ranks until not one was left standing. Finally, Medea used her potions to lull the sleepless dragon into a deep, rhythmic slumber. Jason seized the golden fleece and fled into the night, taking Medea and her young brother with him. The return journey was a path of blood and betrayal. To slow down the pursuing fleet of Aetes, Medea performed a horrific act. She killed her own brother and cast his limbs into the sea. The king was forced to stop and gather the remains for a proper burial, allowing the Argo to escape. When they returned to Iolcus, the fleece did not bring the peace Jason had envisioned. Peleus still refused to yield the throne, and Medea's magic took a darker turn. She convinced the daughters of Peleus that she could restore their father's youth by cutting him into pieces and boiling him in a cauldron. The daughters, desperate for their father's restoration, performed the deed, only to realize Medea had tricked them into regicide. The people of Iolcus were horrified by the blood on Jason's hands, and he was forced into exile once more. The hero and his sorceress queen settled in Corinth, but the love that had sustained them through the voyage was beginning to rot. Jason, seeking a more stable legitimacy, decided to leave Medea for the daughter of the king of Corinth. But Medea was not a woman to be discarded. In a fit of divine and human rage, she killed the bride, the king, and her own children fathered by Jason to ensure his misery was total. She fled in a chariot drawn by dragons, leaving Jason as a broken man sitting in the shadow of his aging ship. Years later, while resting beneath the rotting prow of the Argo, a piece of the wood fell and crushed him. The quest for the fleece had ended in a hollow victory and a landscape of ash. But while the heroes of the Argo faded, the foundations of the great city-states were still being laid in blood. In the land of Boeotia, a man named Cadmus was following a cow to a destiny he did not yet understand. The voyage of the Argo had proven that heroes could conquer the sea, but the land of Greece remained a wild and fractured frontier. While the lineage of Perseus was consolidating power in the south, a new and cursed dynasty was taking root in the heart of Boeotia. Our story shifts to the Phoenician prince Cadmus, a man who was never intended to be a king of the Greeks. His journey began not with a desire for a throne, but with a desperate, frantic search for a lost sister. Europa, the daughter of King Agenor of Tyre, had been abducted by Zeus in the form of a magnificent white bull. Agenor was decimated by the loss of his daughter and issued a command that would change the course of history. He sent his sons into the world with a final rhythmic ultimatum: do not return until you have found your sister. Cadmus traveled for years, searching every corner of the known world, but the trail of the divine bull had gone cold. He eventually sought the counsel of the oracle at Delphi, looking for a way to fulfill his father's command. But the oracle gave him a new and unexpected purpose. She told him to stop searching for Europa and instead follow a specific heifer with a white moon-shaped mark on its flank. Cadmus was to follow the animal until it collapsed from exhaustion and found a city on that very spot. He found the cow and followed it across the plains of Boeotia for days, watching its rhythmic, steady pace. When the animal finally fell, Cadmus prepared a sacrifice to the gods to mark the foundation of his new home. He sent his men to fetch water from a nearby spring, but they did not return. A massive dragon, the sacred offspring of Ares, guarded the waters with a lethal, venomous focus. The beast had decimated Cadmus's companions, crushing them in its coils and tearing them with its fangs. Cadmus, now alone, faced the monster in a battle that shook the very earth of the future city. But the prince was a man of immense physical courage and silver-tongued ingenuity. He struck the dragon down, driving his spear through its throat and pinning it to a great oak tree. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, descended from the heavens and gave him a strange, rhythmic instruction. She told him to pull the teeth from the dragon's jaw and sow them into the earth like seeds in a field. Cadmus did as he was told, and the soil began to heave and crack. From the ground rose a race of fully armed warriors, their eyes burning with a primal, animalistic rage. They were the Spartoi, the sown men, and they immediately turned their weapons on one another. Cadmus watched in horror as the warriors decimated their own ranks in a frantic, bloody skirmish. Only 5 survived the carnage, eventually laying down their arms and swearing a blood oath of loyalty to Cadmus. These 5 men became the founding nobility of the city of Cadmea, the citadel that would grow into the mighty Thebes. But the shedding of the dragon's blood required a period of divine atonement. Cadmus was forced to serve Ares for 8 long years. a period of labor that tested his resolve and his legitimacy. When his service was complete, the gods chose to reward him with a union that seemed to signal a new golden age. He was given the hand of Harmonia, the daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, in the first wedding where all the Olympians were present. The gods descended from their heights, bringing gifts of celestial bronze and divine garments. Hephaestus himself crafted a magnificent necklace for the bride, a piece of jewelry that shone with a rhythmic, pulsing light. However, this necklace was cursed, a physical manifestation of the resentment Ares felt for the slayer of his dragon. The sovereign handoff of Thebes began under the shadow of this hidden malice. Cadmus and Harmonia had many children, but their lives were marked by a constant grinding turmoil. Their daughter Ino was driven mad by Hera. Their grandson Actaeon was torn apart by his own hounds, and their daughter Semele was consumed by the fire of Zeus. The house of Cadmus was being decimated by the very gods who had attended his wedding. In their old age, Cadmus and Harmonia were driven from the city they had founded, forced into exile in the wild lands of Illyria. They looked back at the walls of Thebes and realized that their bloodline was destined for tragedy. Cadmus prayed that if the life of a serpent was so precious to the gods, he might become one himself. In a final, chilling transformation, the king and queen were turned into great, shimmering snakes. They were carried away to the islands of the blessed, leaving the throne of Thebes to a lineage that would become the most cursed in all of human history. The city of the dragon's teeth was now a prize for any usurper who could claim it. But the shadows of the past were about to converge on a single, doomed man who would solve a riddle only to destroy himself. The throne of Thebes did not sit empty for long, and the sovereign handoff was marked by blood and divine madness. After the departure of Cadmus, power fell to his grandson Perseus, a man of cold logic who despised the wild rituals of the gods. Perseus was a usurper of the natural order, and he was torn limb from limb by the followers of Dionysus, killed by his own mother in a state of religious frenzy. The crown then passed to Labdacus, the son of Polydorus, who gave his name to the dynasty but died young, leaving the city in a state of absolute turmoil. His infant son Laius was too small to rule, and the regency was seized by Lycus, a man who consolidated his power through the mistreatment of his own kin. However, the sons of Antiope, Amphion and Zethus eventually marched on the city, slaying Lycus and building the famous seven-gated walls of Thebes. Laius was forced into exile, finding refuge in the court of Pelops, the king of Pisa. It was here that Laius committed a crime that would stain his bloodline for generations. He abducted the king's son, Chrysippus, and for this violation of hospitality, a curse was laid upon the house of Labdacus. When the usurpers, Amphion and Zethus, died, Laius returned to Thebes to claim his rightful throne. He took Jocasta as his queen, but the marriage was a hollow and fearful union. Laius traveled to the oracle at Delphi, seeking to know if he would ever have an heir to secure his legitimacy. The oracle's response was a rhythmic, chilling decree of doom. She warned Laius that if he ever fathered a son, that child would grow up to murder his father and marry his mother. Laius was consumed by a sudden clinical paranoia. He avoided the bed of Jocasta for years, but one night, fueled by wine and a moment of lapsed focus, he fathered a child. When the boy was born, the king did not feel the joy of a father. He felt only the cold grip of the prophecy. He ordered the infant's feet to be pierced with a bronze pin and bound together, earning the child the name Oedipus, or Swellfoot. Laius commanded a servant to leave the boy on the jagged peaks of Mount Cithaeron to be decimated by the elements and the wild beasts. But the servant could not bring himself to murder the innocent child. He handed the infant to a shepherd from the city of Corinth, who carried him across the mountains to his own king. King Polybus and Queen Merope of Corinth, who were childless, adopted the boy and raised him as their own prince. Oedipus grew into a young man of immense intellect and focus, believing himself to be the legitimate heir to the Corinthian throne. At a banquet, a drunken guest whispered that Oedipus was a bastard, a changeling who did not belong to the royal house. Stung by the rumor, Oedipus traveled to Delphi to seek the truth of his birth. The oracle did not answer his question. Instead, she repeated the same horrific prophecy she had given to Laius decades before. Oedipus was horrified, and in a desperate attempt to protect Polybus and Merope, he fled Corinth, vowing never to return. He became a wanderer, a man without a city, moving through the world with a heavy heart and a rhythmic, limping gait. His journey led him toward a place where three roads met in the narrow passes of Phocis. At this crossroads, he encountered a chariot carrying an elderly man and his armed guard. The old man was arrogant and commanded Oedipus to step out of the road to let his betters pass. Oedipus, a prince by blood and temperament, refused to yield. A sudden, violent skirmish erupted. In a fit of divine and mortal rage, Oedipus struck down the old man and his guards, killing them all except for a single servant who fled into the woods. Oedipus did not know that he had just performed the first half of his destiny. The man he had killed was Laius, his biological father, and the king of Thebes. The sovereign handoff had been achieved through a murder on a dusty road, but the crown was not yet on his head. Oedipus continued toward Thebes, only to find the city decimated by a different kind of terror. The Sphinx, a monster with the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the head of a woman, had taken up a position on the cliffs outside the gates. She stopped every traveler and issued a rhythmic, deadly riddle. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening? Every man who failed to solve the riddle was seized and devoured by the beast. The city was in a state of absolute siege, and the regent Creon had promised the throne and the hand of the widowed Queen Jocasta to anyone who could destroy the monster. Oedipus did not hesitate. He approached the Sphinx and looked into her cold, predatory eyes. He answered the riddle with a single word: man. The Sphinx, decimated by the loss of her intellectual dominance, threw herself from the cliffs and died on the rocks below. Thebes erupted in a roar of celebration for their savior. Oedipus was ushered into the city and crowned the new king of Thebes. He married Jocasta, the woman who had given him birth, and for many years the city flourished under his wise and focused rule. They had 4 children, 2 sons, Eteocles and Polynices, and 2 daughters, Antigone and Ismene. But the gods are patient, and the stain of the unpunished murder began to rot the very air of Thebes. A plague descended upon the city, a sickness that decimated the crops, the cattle, and the people. The linear grind of fate had finally caught up with the king. Oedipus, ever the man of action, vowed to find the murderer of Laius and exile him from the land. As the investigation deepened, the truth began to emerge with a rhythmic, mechanical cruelty. Tiresias, the blind seer, pointed the finger at the king himself. The shepherd from the mountain and the servant from the crossroads were brought forward, their stories interlocking like the teeth of a jagged gear. The horror was absolute. Jocasta, realizing the truth, took her own life in the privacy of the royal bedchamber. Oedipus found her there and, in a moment of utter turmoil, seized the golden brooches from her gown. He plunged the pins into his own eyes, blinding himself so he would never have to look upon the world he had accidentally destroyed. The king who had solved the riddle was now a broken beggar, cast out of the city by his own decree. He departed into exile, led by the hand of his faithful daughter, Antigone. The throne was once again vacant, and the sons of Oedipus were already sharpening their swords for a civil war that would level the walls of Cadmus. The departure of Oedipus left a vacuum of power that the ancient soil of Thebes could not easily fill. The sovereign handoff was supposed to be a shared burden between his two sons, Eteocles and Polynices. They agreed to a rhythmic, alternating rule. One brother would hold the throne for a single year while the other lived in exile, and then they would trade. It was a plan born of necessity, but it failed to account for the corrosive nature of absolute power. Eteocles took the first turn, sitting upon the throne of Cadmus and feeling the weight of the golden crown. But as his year drew to a close, a cold and clinical paranoia took root in his heart. He looked at the walls of the city and the loyalty of the guards, and decided that he would not be a king for a season. When Polynices returned to claim his rightful ascension, Eteocles refused to open the gates. He declared his brother a threat to the state and an unwanted usurper, forcing Polynices back into the wilderness. Polynices was decimated by this betrayal, his heart filled with a burning desire for vengeance. He traveled south to the city of Argos, arriving at the palace of King Adrastus on a night of absolute storm. There, he encountered another exiled prince, Tydeus, and the two men began a violent skirmish in the dark. King Adrastus intervened, seeing in the two men the fulfillment of a prophecy involving a boar and a lion. He gave his daughters to the exiles in marriage, promising to restore Polynices to the throne of Thebes through the force of arms. This was the beginning of the first great coalition of the heroic age. 7 great champions were chosen to lead the assault, each assigned to one of the 7 gates of Thebes. There was Adrastus the king, the fierce Tydeus, the seer Amphiaraus, who knew he was marching to his death, and Polynices himself. The army of Argos was a massive, clanking machine of bronze and iron, marching toward the city of the dragon's teeth. But the city of Thebes was not easily decimated. Inside the walls, Eteocles prepared a defense that was just as rhythmic and calculated as the assault. He assigned 7 of his own best warriors to meet the champions at each gate, turning the war into a series of individual bloody duels. The linear grind of the siege lasted for days, the air thick with the screams of the dying and the smell of scorched earth. The seer Amphiaraus had warned that only Adrastus would survive the campaign, but the heroes were blinded by their own quest for legitimacy. At the first gate, Tydeus fought with a cannibalistic rage, but he was struck down by a mortal wound. As he lay dying, Athena intended to grant him immortality, but she turned away in disgust when she saw him devouring the brains of his fallen enemy. One by one, the champions of Argos were cut down or swallowed by the earth. Amphiaraus and his chariot were engulfed by a massive chasm created by a thunderbolt from Zeus. The war reached its inevitable, tragic crescendo at the 7th gate. There, the two brothers, Eteocles and Polynices, finally faced each other in the mud of their ancestral home. It was not a battle of heroes, but a rhythmic, mutual slaughter fueled by a lifetime of resentment. They struck each other at the exact same moment, their spears piercing the hearts of the only family they had left. The two sons of Oedipus died in the dust, their blood mingling in a final, cursed embrace. With the deaths of the princes, the Argive army collapsed in a state of absolute turmoil and retreated in shame. Only King Adrastus escaped, saved by the speed of his divine horse, Arion. The sovereign handoff was now complete, but the prize was a city of ghosts. The regency fell once again to Creon, the brother of the fallen Jocasta. Creon was a man of iron law, determined to consolidate his power by ending the cycle of rebellion. He issued a decree that Eteocles, the defender of the city, would be buried with full military honors. He declared that Polynices, the invader, was to be left unburied on the battlefield, to be taken by the vultures and the dogs. This was a violation of the most sacred divine laws, for an unburied soul could never find rest in the house of Hades. Antigone, the daughter of Oedipus, could not stand by and watch her brother's legitimacy denied even in death. Antigone defied the king's order under the cover of night, sprinkling a handful of dust over the body of Polynices. She was captured by the guards and brought before Creon, who was outraged by her lack of remorse. In a fit of cold, administrative cruelty, he ordered Antigone to be buried alive in a stone tomb. But this act of tyranny backfired with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. Creon's own son, Haemon, who was betrothed to Antigone, took his own life in grief. The queen, Eurydice, followed her son into the darkness, leaving Creon alone in a palace of silence. The house of Labdacus was finally extinguished, its stories written in the blood of its own children. But while Thebes was being torn apart, a new and even greater conflict was beginning to simmer on the shores of the Aegean. A wedding was being planned that would bring the gods and the heroes together for the last time. While the walls of Thebes were still stained with the blood of brothers, the focus of the gods shifted to the north. The Olympian order had survived its infancy, but the world of men was becoming a complicated web of bloodlines and shifting loyalties. Zeus looked down at the mortal race and saw a population that was growing too large and too prideful. He sought a way to decimate the numbers of men and bring the heroic age to a definitive, thunderous conclusion. The spark for this final fire was struck at a wedding. Peleus, a king of the Myrmidons and a man of immense physical courage, had been chosen by the gods to marry the sea nymph Thetis. Thetis was a goddess of such beauty and power that both Zeus and Poseidon had once pursued her. But a prophecy revealed that she would bear a son far greater than his father. Zeus, ever mindful of his own legitimacy, forced Thetis to marry a mortal man to ensure her child would not challenge the heavens. The wedding was held on the slopes of Mount Pelion, and it was a gathering of absolute divine and mortal splendor. Every god and goddess was invited to the feast, bringing gifts of celestial bronze and immortal horses. But one deity was pointedly left off the guest list. Ares, the goddess of discord and the personification of strife, was not welcome at a celebration of union. She was decimated by the snub and decided to leave a gift of her own, one that would rot the world from the inside out. She arrived at the gates of the palace and cast a single shimmering object into the center of the hall. It was a golden apple plucked from the gardens of the Hesperides, inscribed with a single rhythmic phrase, "To the fairest." In an instant, the joy of the wedding was replaced by a cold and clinical vanity. 3 goddesses stood to claim the prize: Hera, the queen of heaven, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love. They turned to Zeus to settle the dispute, but the king of the gods was too wise to choose between his wife, his daughter, and his aunt. He delegated the task to a mortal, seeking a judge whose heart was not yet hardened by the politics of Olympus. He chose Paris, a young prince of Troy who was living as a humble shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida. Paris was a man of focus and beauty, but his birth had been marked by a terrifying omen. His mother, Queen Hecuba, had dreamed she gave birth to a flaming torch that consumed the entire city of Troy. The king, Priam, had ordered the infant to be decimated on the mountainside, but the boy had survived, raised by shepherds in the wilderness. The 3 goddesses descended upon the mountain, appearing to Paris in a flash of divine light. They did not ask him to judge their beauty alone. They offered him bribes of absolute power. Hera offered him the throne of all Asia, a kingdom that would make him the greatest emperor the world had ever known. Athena offered him the gift of wisdom and a rhythmic mastery of the battlefield. But Aphrodite looked into the youth's heart and saw a desire for something more intimate. She offered him the hand of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, driven by impulse and a lack of foresight, chose Aphrodite. He handed her the golden apple, And in that moment, the fate of Troy was sealed in stone. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, the daughter of Zeus and leader. But there was a complication that would lead to a decade of slaughter. Helen was already married. She was the queen of Sparta, sitting on the throne beside King Menelaus. The sovereign handoff of the Spartan crown had been a tense affair, settled only when all the great kings of Greece swore a blood oath. They had agreed to defend the choice of Helen's husband and to wage war against anyone who dared to steal her away. Paris traveled to Sparta under the guise of a diplomatic mission, a guest in the house of Menelaus. But he violated the sacred laws of hospitality, the xenia that held the Greek world together. While Menelaus was away at a funeral in Crete, Paris abducted Helen and seized a vast portion of the Spartan treasury. They fled across the Aegean, returning to the high walls of Troy. When Menelaus returned to an empty palace and a decimated reputation, the rhythmic drum of war began to beat across the Peloponnese. He turned to his brother, Agamemnon, the High King of Mycenae and the most powerful man in Greece. Agamemnon saw the abduction not as a personal insult, but as a chance to consolidate his rule over the entire Aegean. He invoked the oath of the suitors, calling every king and every hero to gather their ships at the port of Aulis. The kings of Ithaca, of Argos, of Salamis, and of Crete responded to the call. 1,000 ships gathered in the harbor, a forest of masts and a sea of bronze armor. But the winds refused to blow. The goddess Artemis was angry with Agamemnon for a slight against her sacred deer, and she demanded a horrific sacrifice to release the fleet. Agamemnon was forced to lure his own daughter, Iphigenia, to the camp under the pretense of a marriage to Achilles. In a moment of absolute turmoil, the king chose his ambition over his blood. The girl was sacrificed on the altar, and the winds finally began to howl toward the east. The Great War was no longer a threat. It was a physical reality moving across the water. The apple of discord had done its work, and the fields of Troy were waiting for the harvest of death. The 1,000 ships cut through the wine-dark sea like a forest of moving timber. The Greek fleet was a massive, clanking machine of bronze, carrying a generation of men who would never see their homes again. At the head of this armada was Agamemnon, the High King of Mycenae, a man whose ambition was as vast as the ocean he crossed. But the sovereign handoff of the expedition's true power did not lie with the king. It lay with a young man from Phthia. Achilles, the son of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, was the ultimate weapon of the Greek cause. He was a man of absolute physical perfection and a focus that bordered on the divine. His mother had dipped him in the river Styx as an infant, making his flesh invulnerable to the blades of men, save for his heel. Beside him stood Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, a man whose silver-tongued cunning would be more valuable than 1,000 spears. There was Ajax the Great, a mountain of a man who carried a shield of 7 cowhides, and Diomedes, the youngest and most disciplined of the kings. When the prows of the ships finally bit into the sands of the Troad, the linear grind of the war officially began. The first man to leap onto the shore was Protesilaus, a hero who knew that a prophecy marked the first to land for death. He was struck down by a Trojan spear before his feet could even find purchase in the mud, the first blood of a decade-long harvest. The Trojans, led by the noble Prince Hector, met the invaders at the water's edge. Hector was the eldest son of King Priam, a man of duty and honor who fought not for glory, but for the survival of his city. But the Trojan walls were not built by human hands. They had been raised by Poseidon and Apollo during a time of divine service. They were massive, rhythmic structures of stone that defied the primitive siege engines of the Greeks. The first clash was a chaotic, bloody skirmish that forced the Trojans back behind their gates. Agamemnon ordered the Greeks to dig a deep trench and build a wooden wall to protect their ships. This became the Greek camp, a city of tents and huts that would remain for 9 grueling years. The war was not a constant battle, but a rhythmic cycle of raids and long periods of boredom. The Greeks decimated the surrounding country, sacking smaller cities to provide food and female captives for the army. Achilles led these expeditions with a clinical efficiency, bringing back treasures that were divided among the kings to maintain their legitimacy. But after 9 years of stalemate, the internal politics of the Greek camp reached a point of absolute turmoil. During a raid on a nearby temple, the Greeks captured Chryseis, the daughter of a priest of Apollo. She was awarded to Agamemnon as his prize of war, a symbol of his high status. However, the priest came to the Greek camp with a king's ransom, begging for the return of his daughter. Agamemnon, fueled by a cold and arrogant pride, insulted the old man and drove him away. The priest prayed to Apollo, and the god of the silver bow responded with a rhythmic, invisible death. A plague descended upon the Greek camp, decimating the ranks of the soldiers and the cattle alike. The air was thick with the smoke of funeral pyres, and the army began to murmur against their leader. Achilles, sensing the collapse of the mission, called an assembly and demanded that the girl be returned to stop the divine wrath. Agamemnon agreed, but he demanded a new prize to replace his lost legitimacy. He seized Briseis, the beautiful captive who had been awarded to Achilles. This was a violation of the hero's honor that could not be ignored. Achilles did not draw his sword, for Athena stayed his hand, but he performed a different kind of strike. He withdrew his forces, the Myrmidons, from the war, vowing that he would not lift a finger while Agamemnon's army was slaughtered. He sat on the shore, watching the waves and nursing a rage that would change the course of history. Without Achilles, the balance of power shifted toward the Trojans. Hector saw the opportunity and led a massive sortie from the gates, driving the Greeks back toward their own walls. The Trojan fire began to rain down upon the ships, threatening to burn the Greeks' only hope of escape. The linear grind of the siege had turned into a desperate fight for survival. Patroclus, the closest companion and perhaps the lover of Achilles, could not bear to see his countrymen decimated. He begged Achilles to return, but the hero's pride was a wall more impenetrable than the stones of Troy. Patroclus asked to wear Achilles' armor, hoping the sight of the divine bronze would strike terror into Trojan hearts. Achilles agreed, but he gave Patroclus a rhythmic, stern warning. Drive them back from the ships, but do not pursue them to the city. Patroclus entered the fray like a whirlwind, and the Trojans fled, believing the invincible Achilles had returned. But in the heat of the slaughter, Patroclus forgot the warning. He chased the Trojans to the very walls of the city, where he was met by the spear of Hector. The young man was struck down, his spirit departing for the house of Hades, and the armor of Achilles was stripped as a trophy. When the news reached the shore, the silence of Achilles was replaced by a scream that shook the foundations of the world. The hero was no longer interested in honor or prizes. He was a vessel for absolute, unadulterated vengeance. The final act of the Great War was about to begin, and the dust of Troy was hungry for the blood of kings. Achilles stood on the shore, a man no longer composed of flesh and blood, but of a cold, white-hot fury. The death of Patroclus had decimated the last of his restraint. He had no armor, for Hector now wore the divine bronze stripped from the corpse of his friend. But the hero's mother, the sea nymph Thetis, descended from the heavens to provide a final gift of legitimacy. She traveled to the subterranean forge of Hephaestus, the smith god of Olympus. Hephaestus fashioned a new suit of armor, a shield of 5 layers of metal that depicted the entire world in a rhythmic golden relief. When Achilles donned the new gear, he shone with a light that blinded the Trojan sentries. He returned to the battlefield not to win a war, but to perform a systematic execution. The river Scamander became choked with the bodies of those who tried to flee his path. The river god himself rose up in absolute turmoil, trying to drown the hero in a torrent of mud and water. But Achilles was unstoppable. His focus narrowed to the single figure of the Trojan prince. Hector stood alone outside the Scaean gates, the last line of defense for the city of Priam. He saw the son of Peleus approaching like a falling star, and for a moment, the courage of the champion faltered. He ran 3 times around the walls of Troy, a rhythmic, desperate race against a death that could not be outrun. Athena, disguised as Hector's brother, tricked the prince into standing his ground. The duel was short and brutal, a collision of divine destiny and mortal duty. Achilles drove his spear into the small gap in the armor at Hector's neck. As the prince lay dying, he begged for his body to be returned to his father for a proper burial. But Achilles felt no mercy. He felt only the void left by Patroclus. He whispered, "Dogs and vultures shall rend your flesh," his voice as cold as the winter sea. He pierced Hector's ankles and threaded leather thongs through the bone, tying the fallen prince to the back of his chariot. Achilles drove at a gallop around the city, dragging the head of Troy's protector through the dust. The linear grind of the war had reached its most horrific crescendo. For 12 days, Achilles desecrated the body, but the gods preserved Hector's flesh from decay. The king of the gods finally intervened, for even divine vengeance had its limits. King Priam, guided by Hermes, slipped into the Greek camp under the cover of night. The old man knelt before the man who had murdered his sons and kissed the hands that had decimated his house. He asked Achilles to remember his own father Peleus and the grief that awaited him. In a moment of shared human sorrow, the rage of Achilles finally broke. He wept with the old king, and he returned the body of Hector, granting a 12-day truce for the funeral rites. But the fate of Achilles was tied to the fate of the city. Shortly after the games for Hector, Paris, the man who had started the war with a golden apple, found his mark. Guided by the hand of Apollo, Paris fired an arrow from the walls that struck Achilles in his only vulnerable point, his heel. The greatest warrior of the age fell in the dirt, his divine blood soaking into the Trojan soil. The Greeks were decimated by the loss of their champion, and the war returned to a state of absolute stalemate. But the sovereign handoff of victory was not to be achieved by strength, and it would be won by the cunning of a single mind. Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, devised a plan that would bypass the walls Poseidon had built. The Greeks constructed a massive hollow wooden horse, inscribed with a message of surrender to the goddess Athena. They hid their best warriors inside the belly of the beast and sailed their fleet behind the nearby island of Tenedos. The Trojans emerged from their gates the next morning to find an empty camp and a silent shore. They believed the long nightmare was over, that the Greeks had finally been decimated by exhaustion. Despite the warnings of the priest Laocoon and the prophetess Cassandra, the Trojans pulled the horse into the city. They spent the night in a rhythmic, drunken celebration, their focus lost to the wine and the music. At midnight, when the city was silent and the fires were low, the sovereign handoff of the city began. Odysseus and his men climbed down from the horse and opened the gates to the returning Greek fleet. The sack of Troy was not a battle, it was a massacre. The city was decimated by fire, and the sword, the ancient palace of Priam, leveled to the ground. King Priam was killed at the altar of Zeus, and the infant heir of Hector was thrown from the walls. The linear grind of 10 years ended in a single night of absolute, unmitigated horror. The women of Troy were led away in chains, and the gold of the East was loaded onto the Greek ships. Troy became a memory, a pillar of smoke rising into the morning sky. But the gods were watching the cruelty of the victors, and the journey home would be a trial that few would survive. The fires of Troy were still smoldering when the Greek kings began to load their ships with the spoils of a decade of slaughter. They believed the hard work was over and that a swift wind would carry them back to the thrones they had left behind. But the gods of Olympus were no longer spectators. They were a jury decimated by the lack of respect shown to their temples during the sack of the city. Athena and Poseidon, who had once championed the Greek cause, now turned their divine focus toward vengeance. The sovereign handoff of the homeward journey became a rhythmic, grueling trial of survival and divine retribution. The fleet of Agamemnon, the High King of Mycenae, set sail with a pride that bordered on a clinical delusion. He reached the shores of his kingdom, believing his legitimacy was absolute and his victory was his shield. But the house he returned to was not the one he had left 10 years prior. His wife, Clytemnestra, was consumed by a cold, calculating hatred for the man who had sacrificed their daughter to the winds. She had taken a lover, Aegisthus, a usurper, who had been biding his time in the shadows of the palace. As Agamemnon stepped into his bath to wash away the dust of Troy, the trap was sprung with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. Clytemnestra entangled him in a heavy net-like robe and struck him down with an axe, the High King of Greece dying in a puddle of his own blood. The throne of Mycenae was seized by the usurpers, and the linear grind of the curse of Atreus continued in the dark. Meanwhile, King Menelaus was driven off course to the distant shores of Egypt. He was forced to wrestle the sea god Prometheus to learn the secret of the winds, enduring years of exile before he could return to Sparta with Helen. But the most famous and most agonizing journey was that of Odysseus, the king of Ithaca. His return was not a voyage of weeks, but a 10-year odyssey that would test the very limits of human endurance and focus. It began with a raid on the Cicones, a rhythmic skirmish that left his men overconfident and vulnerable. A storm then drove his 12 ships to the land of the Lotus Eaters, where the people lived in a state of absolute drug-induced apathy. His men ate the honey-sweet fruit and forgot their homes, their wives, and their desire for legitimacy. Odysseus had to drag them back to the ships by force, chaining them to the benches to maintain his command. The journey then led them to the island of the Cyclopes, a race of lawless giants who knew nothing of the sacred laws of hospitality. Odysseus and his men were trapped in the cave of Polyphemus, a son of Poseidon who began to devour the crew 2 by 2. The king of Ithaca did not use his sword. He used his silver-tongued cunning to blind the giant and escape beneath the bellies of sheep. But as he sailed away, his pride got the better of his focus. He shouted his true name to the blinded giant, and Polyphemus prayed to his father, Poseidon, to ensure Odysseus never saw his home again. The curse of the sea god became a rhythmic, pounding weight upon the Ithaca fleet. They reached the island of Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, who gifted Odysseus a bag containing all the storm winds of the world. Ithaca was in sight, the smoke rising from the hearths of their own homes. But while Odysseus slept, his crew, fueled by a paranoid curiosity, opened the bag, believing it contained hidden gold. The winds erupted in a sudden, violent crescendo, blowing the ships back across the ocean to the very start of their journey. The fleet was later decimated by the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibal giants who pelted the ships with massive stones. Only the ship of Odysseus escaped the carnage, sailing into the unknown with a crew that was now a fraction of its original strength. They reached the island of Aeaea, the home of the sorceress Circe, who turned the men into swine with a rhythmic wave of her wand. Odysseus, protected by the divine herb moly, confronted the goddess and forced her to restore his companions. They stayed in her palace for a year, their focus softened by the luxury and the wine. But the memory of Ithaca would not be decimated. On Circe's advice, Odysseus performed a task that no living man should ever attempt. He traveled to the edge of the world and descended into the dark, echoing house of Hades. There he sought the counsel of the dead seer Tiresias, learning that his path home was a linear grind of sacrifice and loss. He spoke with the ghost of his mother and the spirits of the fallen heroes of Troy, realizing that the world he knew was already a ghost of itself. The voyage continued through a landscape of absolute mythic terror. They sailed past the Sirens, whose song was a rhythmic, beautiful trap that led men to their deaths on the rocks. They navigated the narrow strait between Scylla, the six-headed monster, and Charybdis, the whirlpool that swallowed the sea. Odysseus lost 6 more men to the snapping jaws of Scylla, but he kept his ship moving with a cold, desperate focus. The final disaster struck on the island of Thrinacia, where the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios grazed in the meadows. Despite the warnings, the starving crew slaughtered the cattle, and Zeus responded with a single, devastating thunderbolt. The ship was shattered, and every man was decimated by the waves, leaving only Odysseus alive. He drifted for 9 days on a piece of the mast, until he reached the island of Aegigia. There he was held captive for 7 years by the nymph Calypso, who offered him immortality if he would forget his mortal life. But Odysseus sat on the shore every day, looking toward the horizon and weeping for the rocky soil of Ithaca. The gods finally intervened, and Odysseus was allowed to build a raft and set out once more. He was wrecked one final time on the shores of Phaeacia, where he was treated with the respect due to a king. The Phaeacians provided him with a ship that moved as fast as thought, and at long last Odysseus was laid upon the sand of Ithaca while he slept. He returned not as a conqueror, but as a beggar in his own land. His palace was filled with 100 suitors, local lords who were consuming his wealth and pressuring his queen Penelope to marry. They were a gang of usurpers who believed the king was dead and that his legitimacy was a thing of the past. Odysseus, guided by the goddess Athena, moved through his halls in disguise, watching the arrogance of the men who had decimated his house. The climax of the saga was a rhythmic, bloody archery contest. Odysseus seized his great bow, a weapon that only he could string, and sent an arrow through 12 axe heads. He then turned the bow on the suitors, raining down a clinical, unyielding death until the floors of the hall ran red. The king of Ithaca had reclaimed his throne, and his long way home was finally at an end. But the age of the heroes was fading, and the era of the blood curse was reaching its final, poetic conclusion. The return of Agamemnon had ended in a bath of blood, leaving the high throne of Mycenae in the hands of a murderer. For 7 long years, the usurper Aegisthus sat upon the seat of the King of Kings. He ruled with a clinical paranoia, knowing that his legitimacy was built on a foundation of betrayal and a queen's cold resentment. Clytemnestra stood by his side, her heart decimated by the memory of her daughter Iphigenia, sacrificed for a war she never wanted. But the sovereign handoff of the Mycenaean crown was far from settled. In the distance, a young boy had grown into a man of absolute focus and a rhythmic, pulsing desire for vengeance. Orestes, the son of Agamemnon, had been smuggled out of the city by his sister Electra on the night of their father's murder. He was raised in the court of Photis, where he formed a bond of iron with the prince Pylades. As Orestes reached maturity, the god Apollo issued a rhythmic and terrifying decree at the Oracle of Delphi. He commanded Orestes to return to his ancestral home and strike down the killers of his father. However, this was a divine trap of absolute proportions. To avenge a father's murder, Orestes was forced to commit the most sacred and horrific of crimes, the slaying of his own mother. Orestes and Pylades traveled to Mycenae in secret, appearing as humble messengers at the palace gates. They met Electra at the tomb of the fallen king, where she had spent years in a state of absolute mourning and silent rage. The siblings plotted the final sovereign handoff that would be written in the blood of their parents. Orestes entered the palace and first struck down Aegisthus, the usurper who had enjoyed a decade of stolen glory. But the true trial was the confrontation with Clytemnestra. The queen faced her son, bearing the breast that had nourished him and pleading for her life. For a moment, the focus of Orestes wavered, his heart decimated by the weight of the taboo he was about to break. But Pylades reminded him of the command of Apollo and the rhythmic inevitability of fate. Orestes drove his sword home, killing his mother and reclaiming the throne of his father. In an instant, the legitimacy he sought was replaced by a screaming, invisible horror. From the dark places of the earth rose the Erinyes, the Furies, the ancient spirits of vengeance who punished the shedding of kindred blood. They were hags with snakes for hair and eyes that wept blood, visible only to the mind of the matricide. Orestes was driven into a state of absolute madness, fleeing the palace of Mycenae as a broken, howling exile. He wandered the earth for years, a king who could not sit on a throne because the ground itself cried out against him. He eventually reached the city of Athens, falling at the feet of the statue of Athena and begging for a final judgment. Athena saw that the cycle of rhythmic blood vengeance was a grind that would eventually consume the entire race of man. She established the Areopagus, a council of mortal judges, to hear the case of the house of Atreus. It was the first transition from the law of the sword to the law of the city. The jury was split, but Athena cast the deciding vote for mercy, breaking the ancient curse of the bloodline. The Furies were pacified, transformed into the Eumenides, the kindly ones, and Orestes was allowed to return to Mycenae as a rightful king. But the world he returned to was no longer the world of his ancestors. The great heroes who had fought at Troy were nearly all dead, their houses decimated by betrayal or the long, slow rot of time. The gods were beginning to withdraw from the direct affairs of men, their voices becoming echoes in the wind rather than thunder in the sky. The linear grind of the heroic age was reaching its final quiet conclusion. In the north, the descendants of Heracles, the Heraclidae, were preparing for a final massive migration into the south. They claimed the Peloponnese as their divine birthright, a sovereign handoff that would sweep away the last of the Mycenaean strongholds. The palaces of stone and gold were burned or abandoned, replaced by the iron tools and the humbler cities of the new era. The age of the giants and the sons of gods was fading into the mists of memory. The stories were becoming myths, and the myths were becoming the foundation of a world that would soon forget the sound of the gods' footsteps. The twilight had come for the heroes, and the night was long and silent. The smoke of the funeral pyres of the heroes eventually drifted away, leaving a world that was suddenly and terrifyingly quiet. The sovereign handoff of the Peloponnese fell to the Dorian tribes, who brought iron and a new, harsher order to the land of the Mycenaeans. The palaces of Agamemnon and the walls of Cadmus were decimated by time and the encroaching forests, their stones becoming the foundations for humbler homes. The gods of Olympus did not flee the mountain, but they grew distant, their voices no longer heard in the clatter of the marketplace or the heat of the forge. But as the Dark Age of Greece gave way to the light of the Archaic period, the stories of the gods became the bedrock of a perception that would define the West. The Homeric poems took the scattered rhythmic memories of the heroes and consolidated them into a singular epic that gave the Greek people a shared identity. Temples of white marble rose where the old groves had once been, dedicated to Zeus, Hera, and the grey-eyed Athena with a clinical, architectural precision. However, a new kind of challenge to divine legitimacy was beginning to stir in the minds of the people as the classical age dawned. Philosophers in Ionia and Athens began to ask if the gods were truly the masters of the cosmos, or if the world was governed by a rhythmic, mechanical logic. Xenophanes mocked the poets for giving the gods human vices, while Socrates was decimated by a state that feared his questioning of the old divine order. The sovereign handoff of human understanding moved from the priest to the thinker, and from the oracle to the scientist. But the stories survived the rise and fall of the empires that followed. The Romans conquered the Greek lands by the sword, but they were captivated by the beauty of the myths they found in the wreckage of the cities. They performed a final, massive, sovereign handoff of the mythic corpus, renaming the gods to suit their own tongue: Jupiter, Juno, Mars, and Venus. Through the Roman pulse, the legends of the Titans and the Olympians were carried to the furthest corners of Europe and North Africa. As the centuries ground on, a new faith from the East began to decimate the old altars with a rhythmic, unrelenting fervor. The temples of the gods were closed by the decree of the emperors, their statues buried in the mud or melted down for their bronze. The Olympians were no longer seen as the kings of the world, but as the demons and superstitions of a discarded past. But you cannot kill a god made of words, memory, and the raw architecture of the human soul. The myths survived in the ink of the medieval monks and the feverish brushes of the Renaissance masters who looked back to the Golden Age. The names of the planets in our sky, the constellations that guide our ships, and the very words we use to describe our psychology are all ghosts of the Olympian court. Every time a man feels a titanic struggle or a Herculean task, he is speaking the language of a dead religion that refuses to stay buried. Today, the gods do not reside on the summit of a mountain hidden by clouds, but in the collective imagination of a global civilization. Greece has evolved from a patchwork of warring city-states into a modern nation that stands as a guardian to the cradle of Western thought. The sun still beats down with a rhythmic intensity upon the bleached ancient stones of the Parthenon, standing high above the noise of the modern capital. The blue waters of the Aegean continue to churn with the memory of a trident, reflecting a sky that once belonged to the king of the gods. The tourists walk the paths of the heroes, and the history of Greek mythology is still being written.